distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome on behalf of the Freedom Association to this year's McWhirter lecture named in honour of Norris and Ross. They both worked tirelessly for the cause of freedom. Norris sadly left the world in 2004, having been awarded the CBE for all his efforts by Margaret Thatcher. Ross was martyred for the cause when he was tragically assassinated by the IRA in 1975. Both of those brothers knew the cost of fighting for liberty. For some here, this will be your first lecture. For many others, it could be your fourth, fifth, or sixth. The first was delivered by Norman Tebbit, the Carlton Club, and over the years we've had contributions from Lord Parkinson, Sir Gerald Howarth, Baroness Cox, Nigel Farage, of course, last year. Norris and Ross were twins, born in 1925, I beg your pardon, 75? Make them younger than me. They both served in the Royal Navy, which makes this gathering here aboard HMS President somewhat apposite. I'm sure they would have both loved this particular venue. They became sports journalists. It was out of a desire to provide sporting facts to figures in Fleet Street that they went on to found the Guinness Book of Records, appearing regularly on the BBC Record Breakers show with someone who became a very good friend of mine over the years, the late, great Roy Castle. I seem to say at every lecture as the years go on that those who knew Ross are increasingly few. Those of us who knew Norris in both his political work and in his capacity with the Guinness Book of Records are becoming an ageing, dwindling band. This lecture keeps their memory alive. It's my particular honour to welcome this evening's speaker, Bishop Michael Nazir-Ali. Originally from Asia, he was the first non-white diocesan bishop in the Church of England and was for 15 years a robust, if occasionally frustrated, Bishop of Rochester. I saw a number of battles in the media with Rowan that must have been frustrating for you in the extreme. They were certainly for us. He holds both British and Pakistani citizenship, and from 1999 was a member of the House of Lords, where he was vocal in challenging the diminution of Christian orthodoxy and the increasingly pervasive zeitgeist of moral relativity. He's now president of the Oxford Centre for Training, Research, Advocacy and Dialogue, whose mission is to prepare Christians for ministry in situations where the church is under pressure and in real danger of persecution. He addresses us tonight on the subject of freedom of belief and the persecution of Christians. Would you warmly welcome the Bishop?
Adrian, would it be better if I stood there with that microphone?
It's up to
no,
you.
I'd be in your way then, wouldn't I? Yes,
It's really up to you,
yes.
wherever you want.
I'm just trying to, well, let me stay where I am. Don't cause too much trouble. I've already caused quite a lot of trouble because I couldn't find a place to park. And if not for any other reason, the House of Lords is a very useful place to park. That is where I had to park in the end, and I hope I can recover my car later on, because of course they may have closed up and gone home. I hope they don't. Thank you very much for this invitation, and I was very curious to find out what lay behind the Guinness Book of Records, and I hope that I shall discover what lies behind it this evening. I hope that we can discuss these matters afterwards, because what I shall say is certainly not beyond debate, and I look forward to what you have to say. But I want to begin with a picture. Anyone know what that is?
Cuneiform?
It is cuneiform, the script is, yes, but what's the object?
Drum?
Yeah, it's a cylinder. It's known as the cylinder of Cyrus. Cyrus the Great, who became king of Persia and then emperor of the Persian Empire, which took over from the Babylonian. And when he first became the emperor, he issued a decree, and this is the decree, which set free all the various subjects in his empire and allowed them to return to their homes. Now, we know this apart from the cylinder from the Bible, of course, because the Jewish people who were then in exile in Babylon were allowed to go back home. Now, this cylinder resides in the British Museum, as so much else, of course, but last year they lent it to the National Museum in Tehran. So, as it were, it went back home. And I went with it. I mean, not literally, but at the same time. And I was having some discussion with Iranian officials, and I thought, well, what better to start with than some discussion about their history. And so I began with a sort of set speech that I'd made up by then, about the great tradition of tolerance of the Iranian people as set out in the cylinder of Cyrus, and so on and so forth. And the official who was presiding on the other side looked at me and he said, Bishop, we are not interested in the past, we are only interested in the future. So that was the end of that particular discussion. But as I go around the world in this new work, which Adrian has mentioned, I go, of course, to some of the least promising places for freedom that there are in the world. And yet, when I go there, as with the cylinder of Cyrus, I find quite often that behind the oppression, behind the persecution, behind the denial of freedom, there are sometimes traditions of tolerance, of freedom, and of justice. And I was very sad that at least officialdom in Iran did not want to own the cylinder of Cyrus. But here is another picture. This comes from India, further east, of course, from Iran, and these are the so-called pillars of Ashoka. You've seen these pictures already, Adrian, have you? Now, you don't appear interested at all. Ashoka was a particularly bloody king. He fought in lots of wars, and the upshot of all of that was eventually, for the first time, I think, the unity of India from east to west and north to south. But when he had achieved this unity, he repented of his bloodiness. He became a Buddhist, and he erected these pillars and some rock inscriptions all over the place, giving his people freedom of belief and of expression. So if Cyrus was the 6th century BC, Ashoka was the 3rd century BC. And although he was himself a Buddhist, he allowed freedom of belief to his people, whatever their belief may have been. Again, we find today in many countries, I mean, Buddhism in the West is a fashion, isn't it, and a flavor. But in countries like Burma, Myanmar, or Sri Lanka, there are examples of what you might call Buddhist chauvinism, which refuses to tolerate anything not Buddhist, whether by faith or by culture. That includes Christians, of course, but it also includes Tamils of whatever faith, and Muslims, the Rohingya in Myanmar most recently, and so on. And yet we have this testimony from perhaps their greatest king about freedom and tolerance. And then we have something more familiar. Anyone know what that is? that is, of course, Constantine. And what he has got is the Nicene Creed, by the way. Not in the form that was agreed in his presence, in the more developed form. But what I wanted to mention tonight is not the Nicene Creed, though I was once responsible for its translation and became known as the Ek-Bishop, because the translation hung on a single preposition, as these things sometimes do. But the edict, the so-called Edict of Milan. It's neither an edict nor from Milan, but again a great declaration of freedom. This was after Constantine's great spiritual experience, when he saw the cross in the sky, you know the story. And he then, with his co-emperor at the time, made this declaration of religious freedom. It was not just about the emancipation of Christians, as Christians sometimes understand it to be. It was actually freedom for everyone to believe whatever they wanted to believe, and that included, of course, Christians, who had until then been viciously persecuted in the Roman Empire. At about the same time, within 100 years anyway, of Constantine's great Edict of Milan, there was another edict across the border. At that time, the two great superpowers were Rome and Persia. And Christians were persecuted in the Roman Empire, we know those stories, but they were also persecuted in the Persian Empire. And there are quite as many martyrs there as there were within the borders of the Roman Empire. But within 100 years, a king called Yazdegerd came to the throne, and he also made a declaration of tolerance and of freedom, particularly for Christians, in the Persian Empire. Now, you may say, well, that's all history. Yes, but the significance of the way in which Yazdegerd organized the church in the Persian Empire became the basis for how the world of Islam, when Islam came onto the stage of world history, organized non-Muslim communities. I mean, I'll come to that in a moment. And then, coming to that, as it were, we have this other picture written in the old Arabic script, you see, without many diacritical marks. But this is the so-called Constitution of Medina, the Sahifat al-Medina. When the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, arrived in Medina, he had to come to an agreement not only with his followers there, who were of course Muslims, but with the Jews, who were a very numerous and very powerful presence in and around Medina. And so this Constitution of Medina was drafted, which gave the Jews and the Muslims equal recognition as citizens of the city, and of course equal responsibilities at the same time. This arrangement did not last long, I'm sorry to say, but it was made, and you could say that this is the constitution of the first Islamic state. And when people say to me, as indeed they do, in this place or that, we want to have an Islamic state, I say to them, will it be like the first one? And if not, why not? I've never yet received a satisfactory answer to this question, but it's a question worth asking, of course. Coming to this country, I was so delighted to see that copy of Magna Carta there and its relevance for the 21st century. There it is, but you've got it, of course, in your hands. What lies behind Magna Carta I find fascinating. I mean, it goes back to King Alfred, when the kingdom of Wessex stood on its own. Everything else had been destroyed by the Vikings. And Alfred realized that it was not just the physical defense of the kingdom that was necessary, but the building up of a polity. That he had to create something that could resist barbarism. And he did this in a number of ways, by strengthening the church, by his translations of learned works from ancient times, including Pope Gregory's work on pastoral care. But he also tried to create a tradition of common law. I mean, we are opposite the legal establishment, and it is worth mentioning that he took as his sources what the ancient Britons held, what the people of Wessex had as their customs, even from the Vikings. But he made sure of one thing, that the common law that he was producing was entirely consonant with the Bible, with the Judeo-Christian tradition, with the Ten Commandments. Again and again, after Alfred, right through the Norman conquest, appeal was made to the common law, particularly when St. Anselm, who was then Archbishop of Canterbury, a worthy occupier of that office, he refused to crown Henry I until Henry had agreed the so-called Charter of Liberties, you see. And this Charter of Liberties, these freedoms, are the immediate predecessor of Magna Carta, because it was their rediscovery that triggered the struggle for Magna Carta by the barons, and of course above all by Stephen Langton, another worthy occupant of the See of Canterbury. At the risk of life and limb, of deprivation of office, Langton held Rochester Castle. I mean, you knew that Rochester would have to come in somehow into the discussion. He held Rochester Castle for a whole year against King John. And if it had not been for Stephen Langton, I think we would not have had Magna Carta. But of course, it is said, and I was reading this morning in preparation for this talk, that Magna Carta was primarily about limiting the powers of the king. Yes, it certainly was that. And that itself is Judeo-Christian. The idea of a constitutional monarchy where the king himself is subject to law is from the Bible. If you don't believe me, read Deuteronomy chapter 17 and what the prophet Samuel said successively to Saul and to King David. But as you rightly point out in this booklet, I've had a very hurried look at it, it is about more than that. It's not just about the limitations on royal power, but it is, for example, about trial by jury, about fair taxation, about the liberty of religion, the freedom of the English church, so many of the things that we now take for granted, of course. The date of Magna Carta, I think, is very interesting. 1215 reissued in also 1216 and then 1217 with some modifications. Because this is now the 13th century. And if I asked you just now, when did modernity begin, what would you say? I mean, there are some schoolboy answers, aren't there?
1500.
1500, good. Well, that's anything else? Well, I mean, the fall of Constantinople, 1453, is usually given as the sort of date, isn't it? The beginning of the Renaissance and so forth. But now here is controversy. If I said that it actually began in the 13th century, in our sense, in terms of what we are discussing tonight. And why do I say this? I say it because of the arrival of Aristotle in the West. The Western world had lost a great deal of Greek learning, and it began to come back via the Islamic world to Europe in the 13th century. All politically correct universities teach this, of course. What they don't often teach is how the Muslims got it. And of course the Muslims got it basically through the assiduous work of Christian translators who translated from Greek into Syriac into Arabic, sometimes directly from Greek into Arabic. These translators were usually clergy, so clergy do have their uses, at least sometimes. Now, what the West was receiving back was a translation of a translation of a translation, you see. It came through Jewish traders, so the Hebraic influence is clear. In the end, St. Thomas Aquinas was not satisfied with this for his own students in Paris and elsewhere. So he got hold of a Greek scholar. I mean, Greek scholars were almost as rare in the 13th century as they are now. William of Merbeck, and he got him to translate afresh from the Greek a great deal of Aristotle. Before this, the emphasis had been on a well-governed society. I mean, Magna Carta is, to some extent, an example of that. A well-governed society where a mixture of divine, natural, and human law brought about a society where there was a sense of mutual responsibility, where the different classes had responsibility for one another, for example, and rather than the emphasis on individual rights, the emphasis was on the proper functioning of society as a whole. That had been what you might call the descending theme of political organization until then, seen, of course, most clearly in the work of the papal canonists. They're very important political thinkers, apart from possibly being theologians as well. Not always. But now the emphasis changed. If the former paradigm had been Platonic in some sense, now it was Aristotelian. So the emphasis now was on the natural world and its order and predictability. The emphasis now was on the particular and on the individual, if you like. The individual who was made up of substance and of matter and form, which gave it its substance. Now, that much is Aristotelian, but of course these people, Aquinas particularly, were reading Aristotle in the light of the Bible. Or you might say they were reading the Bible in the light of Aristotle. You take your pick. And although Aristotle had taught the importance of the individual, the Bible taught the intrinsic, inherent, inalienable dignity of the human person. Aristotle did not teach this. You know, Aristotle believed in natural subjection. He believed that some human beings were born for freedom and others for subjection. So he thought that northerners, you see where he's speaking from Greece, northerners had courage but no intelligence, so they could be enslaved. Southerners, on the other hand, according to him, had intelligence but no courage, so they could be enslaved. Of course, the Greeks were the best. But the idea that the human person has inherent dignity that cannot be taken away from them is a Judeo-Christian, not an Aristotelian idea. Now, this emphasis on the person had a number of results, of course. First of all, the person began to be seen as an actor, as an agent, as one who could bring some change in the world, even if limited. Not just someone who's acted upon by other forces, even divinity. Secondly, the idea of conscience came to the fore. That this person made in God's image had a conscience given to him by God or her, which needed to be formed. And of course, in those days, it was the task of the church to form that conscience, and so many of the questions that Aquinas was answering had to do with that formation. And thirdly, the idea of consent, that whatever the nature of government as given by God, and they certainly believed that, it still needed the consent of the person who was being governed. So conscience and consent became very important in this bottom-up view, as it were, as opposed to the top-down. And this had a new life, funnily enough, across the Atlantic. Because the question that was repeatedly being asked was, were the indigenous people of the Americas human? Did they have the same rights, the same freedoms as people in Europe? And of course, there were many vested interests that were wanting to give an answer in the negative at the time. Against this stood the Dominicans, and I think this must be to their eternal credit. Bishop Bartolomé Las Casas, the Bishop of Mexico, held and wrote and put forward and argued that the Indians, as they were called, mistakenly of course, but nevertheless that is what they were called, that the Indians also were human because they had been made in God's image. I mean, this argument was explicitly employed from Genesis 1. Because they were made in God's image, they also had the same freedom of mobility, of family life, of a living for themselves and so forth. And they could not be forced to work, which many of them were being, of course. Their property could not be taken away from them without their consent. And most importantly, they could not be forced to convert to Christianity. Now, this discussion came back to Europe in the Dominican University of Salamanca to start with, but gradually was picked up by early Enlightenment thinkers, particularly Locke. I mean, Locke's arguments, if you read them about human freedom, are exactly the same as those of the Dominicans. Locke also believed in natural freedom. He also believed in inherent dignity. But there was some ambivalence. Locke was also involved, of course, in the Carolinas. I go there regularly these days, in the expulsion of the Indian people from the Carolinas because he had property interests there. So nobody is really as consistent as they may sound. What I'm trying to say in brief is that the idea of natural rights or of human rights did not arise in the Enlightenment, but the moderate Enlightenment certainly picked it up and promoted it. It has clear Judeo-Christian origins. I mean, that's the point to keep in mind. However, if we look at the United Nations Declaration, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we find, see, that's another biblical image, isn't it? Anyone know what's he doing?
Swords and slashes?
Yes, he's beating a sword into a plowshare, and that's outside the UN building. But the UN Declaration of Universal Rights is built, of course, on these ideas of natural rights that had become currency for the last 400 or 500 years. The question is, if this is the case, most countries subscribe to this declaration, why do we have so many violations of freedom in our world today? This having happened. And I just want to mention very briefly the kinds of violations to my mind and in my experience that there are. There is, first of all, simple tyranny. just good old-fashioned tyranny. And if you want an example of that, Eritrea is a very good example of good old-fashioned tyranny. Here, the president first targeted evangelical Christians because they were supposed to be disloyal to the state. They were imprisoned, tortured, they were kept in containers out in the desert, and in the heat of the desert and then the cold of the desert night. I have a book in my bag by an Eritrean folk singer, Helen Berhane, who was imprisoned in such a container, simply for her faith. Nobody spoke out. So what happened? What happens when no one speaks out? It begins to spread. So then he reached out for the Catholic Church, and eventually to the biggest church in Eritrea, the Orthodox. The abduction of the patriarch, and we still do not know his whereabouts, closing down of churches, imprisoning and killing of priests, all sorts of things began to happen. I've been involved in trying to improve the situation of Christians of all kinds in Eritrea. But this is just an example of tyranny, nothing else. But the next example is China. Marxist totalitarianism. We've had almost 100 years of it now. Happily, in some parts of the world where it reigned supreme, it does not so any longer. Andrea Williams was just telling me how amazed she'd been to see President Putin in a Russian Orthodox church behaving as if he was Russian Orthodox. Well, no doubt he is. But a former head of the KGB doing that is a sort of miracle, iconically, however much we take it for granted. But in China, of course, it goes on. I mean, we shouldn't be fooled by the kind of the free market face of China, as far as human rights are concerned. The persecution of Christians, there are some Christians who are officially recognized, of course, as you may know, the Three Self Church, but particularly of the house churches and of those Catholics who want to remain loyal to the Pope. They are the ones who are being persecuted. Bishops are still in prison or under house arrest. Clergy are under arrest. People are exiled from their hometown. Churches are demolished. People are left without a church building. All sorts of things happen. Of course, not only to Christians, also to other groups. But this is what you might call an example of ideological repression. This is not simple tyranny. This is at the service of a particular ideology. And that ideology results in totalitarianism. Peter Hitchens, the brother of the famous Christopher Hitchens, but himself a Christian as well as a journalist, tells us that secular ideologies have always led to totalitarianism. Whether it is the Soviets or the Nazis or even the eventual outcome of the French Revolution. The very bloody way in which it all ended. Well, that's for discussion. I have mentioned the rise of chauvinism of one kind or another. And I was in Bosnia during the civil war there, and I saw the kind of heady mix of religion and ethnicity that can result in the kind of chauvinism which caused the civil war in the former Yugoslavia. This is also now the case in countries like Burma and Sri Lanka, and also in a very real way in India, that the doctrine of Hindutva, that Indianness is being defined by Hinduness. So if you're not a Hindu, you can't really be an Indian. The fact that the church has been there for 2,000 years and Islam for about 12 or 1300 doesn't matter. New anti-conversion laws have resulted in repression of Christians and Muslims both, the destruction of mosques and churches, and certainly India is not the kind of tolerant free democracy that we might mistake it to be. I'm soon to deliver a petition about the increasing persecution of Christians in India, but I'm also aware of the persecution of other groups, Muslims in the Gujarat, for example, in the west of India. Having said all of that, however, a Muslim MP, a Muslim British MP, said to me that 80% of reports of persecution that he receives and denial of freedom come from the Islamic world. Why is this? What are the reasons? And I think the reasons have to be sought in the resurgence of Islam in the last 50 or 60 years. There have been positive aspects to that resurgence, I don't deny that. And certainly I have many moderate Muslim friends who have contributed in one way or another to that resurgence. But on the whole, the resurgence has been backward looking. Not in terms of nostalgia, I mean that might have been excusable, but in terms of building a totalitarian ideology. You might want to call that Islamism or whatever you want to call it. The teaching of hate against people who do not subscribe to such an ideology, even fellow Muslims, but certainly non-Muslims. The emergence of extremist movements, not all of which are violent in themselves, but where extremism, the experience of extremism, can then lead people on to participation in movements that are violent. Everyone was talking about the moderation of the Ikhwan al-Muslimin in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, but we now find that actually it's not so moderate after all, when confronted with a challenge of the kind that presented itself. The Western media were in love with the Arab Spring. Actually there was no Arab Spring. There was certainly a desire among repressed people, Muslims and others, for greater freedom, for greater participation in the economic life of their countries, for example. But the West mistook the kind of electronic enthusiasm of westernized Arab youngsters for a real revolution. If there was a real revolution, it was in the well-disciplined and well-trained organizations like the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, but also the Salafis in Tunisia, in Egypt, and now of course in Syria, in Iraq as well. The question about all of this has to do with power. I had as a teacher a very distinguished man who also became a bishop eventually, Bishop Kenneth Cragg. He died a few months ago, just a few months short of 100, and still writing, more or less until he died. Muslims will tell you that he is one of the most sympathetic students of Islam there has been in the last century. Bishop Kenneth was once asked, said, well, yes, you talk about what is in common between Islam and Christianity, that's wonderful and so on, but what's the difference? What is the difference? And he said, in the end, it is the attitude to power. That's the difference. Christianity believes you change the world by giving up power. Islam believes you change the world by taking power. Now, the question is, if you take power through the ballot box, let us say, that is then what is known as Fath Mubin, manifest victory of Islam. How then can power be lost, even if there is a popular desire to lose power, for the Islamists to lose power? We don't know the answer to that. Is democracy simply for gaining power? I mean, to my mind, the true test of democracy must be, mustn't it, the willingness to lose power as well as to gain it. One of the problems that Egypt has faced in the last year, and I observe it very closely, has been the desire of the Islamist government. This is a moderate Islamist government, mind, not an extremist one. It's not like the Taliban in Afghanistan. Has been the desire to make Sharia the sole source of law. That has been the real issue behind the incompetence, the lack of order, indiscipline, violence, and so forth. And that's the real issue. Now, many moderate people in Egypt, Muslims as well as Christians, were willing for Sharia to be one of the sources of law in a country like Egypt, but not the source of law. Because what happens if it becomes the source of law? Well, what happens to women? That's half the population. Freedom of movement, access to education, employment, rights in the family courts, divorce, custody of children, inheritance, laws of evidence. Women immediately become second class. And then what about non-Muslims? Egypt has the largest Christian community in the Middle East. I don't know if any of you were present at St. Margaret's on Tuesday for the New Year's service of the Coptic Church. What would happen to them? They would once again become dhimmis, tolerated people who are disenfranchised, who are tolerated because they agree to be disenfranchised, who suffer from various civic and political disabilities, and who may be subject from time to time to persecution, as indeed they have been with recent events. At the service we were given a long list of churches, priests and pastors' houses, bookshops, Christian convents, schools that were attacked and burned down to the ground during these disturbances. So I have been arguing, and I am happy to say that Egypt has been given another chance for something like a Bill of Rights to be either part of the Egyptian constitution or to be put side by side with it. What would such a Bill of Rights contain? Well, there would be provision that there was the same law for every citizen of Egypt. The same law. Now, you may think that's obvious, but if Sharia had been enforced, that would certainly not have been the case. That everyone would be equal under the law. You see, even Islamic Sharia scholars say that there are three basic inequalities under Sharia. Between men and women, between Muslim and non-Muslim, of course, and between slave and free. One law for all, the equality of all before the law, a common declaration of citizenship, or a declaration of a common citizenship perhaps is a better way to put it, because as dhimmis, of course, these non-Muslims were not citizens, they were subjects. I think we have a chance in Egypt of getting something along those lines now, but I don't know about Syria. You see, in Syria you have an authoritarian regime where there's been a trade-off. Religious and personal liberty in exchange for restrictions on political liberty. Well, we may have just a few days of political liberty in Syria, maybe, but it'll be followed by the complete extinction of religious and personal liberty there, if some of the people who are in the rebel forces ever come to power. God forbid, may I say. Not that the Assad regime is guiltless or pure in any way. So what about here? When I first began this work, actually, I had thought that most of what I would do would be overseas, and a lot of it, of course, has been, as you've just heard. But I was increasingly drawn into the discussion in this country, which I think is of relevance, if I may just say 2 or 3 things before I stop. I was sitting, there is a room in the House of Lords called the Hume Room. I don't know if you've ever been there, but you get sort of public school food there. So it's always very crowded, you know, sort of toad in the hole and custard pudding and things like that. Usually crowded with men, of course. There's only one rule, it's very cheap as well. The only rule is that you must sit at the next vacant chair, the long dining table. So I was sitting, I went and sat down, and a chap sitting next to me said eventually, he said, "Bishop, I have a confession to make." So I said, "Well, I'm always willing to hear confessions." He said that he had been a leading light in the piloting of the Sunday Trading Bill. Remember the Sunday Trading Bill? Yeah, what havoc that's caused. Anyway, he said he had been, and he said it was the biggest political mistake of his life that he had made. Because what it did was it destroyed a common day for family and friends, I mean, quite apart from the religious importance of it. Now, of course, Libby here will tell you we are getting cases where people are being forced to work on Sunday. Not powerful people, not people like those present here, but those who have to work in the department stores, those who are security guards. Even if they say we need to go to church, we need to go to a place of worship, we need to be with our family, they don't have the clout to gain an exemption. And sometimes we have to struggle for them to get them that opportunity to worship on Sunday and to be with their families, whatever they want. Secondly, the hate crime legislation, which goes far beyond the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, has had a chilling effect on freedom of speech. I mean, I'm putting that mildly, I think. You remember the story of those evangelists in Birmingham who were told by the police, "You can't evangelize here, this is a Muslim area." Recently, we've had a spate of street preachers arrested for causing a nuisance because somebody complained. Well, I don't know what they were saying. I may or may not have agreed with what they were saying. But surely they must have the freedom to say what they were saying. Then, thirdly, whilst there has been a long tradition in Britain of respect for conscience, you remember we saw how the emphasis on conscience had emerged. Whilst there has been this long tradition, conscientious objection during the war, for instance, even in the Second World War, I know some people who were such objectors myself. I heartily deplore the 1967 Abortion Act, not perhaps in the way in which it was framed, but in the way in which it's been exercised, implemented. But even that act recognizes conscience. So it does not force people to take part in terminations of pregnancies if it's against their conscience to do so. The Human Fertilization and Embryology Act, again morally ambiguous, provides for respect for conscience for practitioners. Wonderful, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that the spate of so-called equality legislation in the last few years does not. So the Catholic adoption agencies that had been placing very needy children in families were forced to close because they would not go with what the equality legislation required. Pediatricians advising adoption panels were told that they either had to agree with same-sex adoption by same-sex couples, or they could not serve on the panel at all. They could not advise the panel. They couldn't just opt out of a particular case. Magistrates on the bench. So many cases, registrars, where people have fallen foul of equality legislation, and when they have found themselves in the courts have upheld the principle of equality as far as sexual preferences are concerned, rather than freedom for these people to act according to their conscience. I think this is a very important issue for freedom in this. Whatever you think about same-sex relationships, I mean, that in a way that's not the issue. The issue is whether people ought to be able to act according to their conscience and be free, therefore, to do so. The European Court, 4 of these cases went to the European Court. 2 of them were about wearing crosses, funnily enough. People were forbidden. I mean, this is a very big cross, but where's the cross? Yeah, there's a cross. That was a cross that she was, a senior nursing sister in a hospital in Exeter, forbidden to wear that cross because of health and safety regulations. Well, I mean, health and safety will be the next sort of totalitarian ideology. And the other was, of course, Nazir-Ali, the British Airways worker of whom you have heard. Now, on the crosses, the European Court actually upheld Nazir-Ali's case, but ruled against Shirley Chaplin. And it also ruled against those other 2 cases. I think, that's Gary McFarlane, who was a counsellor with Relate. And whilst he was willing to counsel same-sex couples, as a Christian, he said he was not willing to offer them sexual therapy. So he was sacked from his job. And the other was Lillian Liddell, wasn't it? The registrar in Islington, who simply asked to be excused when there was a civil partnership to be officiated at. And she offered to do extra work instead and so forth, but that was not found to be acceptable, and she was also removed from her job. The point is this, that although each case was treated differently by the European Court of Human Rights, the court did say that there were important principles here of balancing rights for national governments. And I think that's the issue that I want to leave you with. How are these rights to be balanced? I mean, are rights about sexual preferences, whatever they may be, of such weight that all other rights must be denied because of them? Because we could be in a situation where that will now happen as a matter of course. What I wanted to show you, and I will stop now, is that we are really talking about a single issue in the world. Whether it is in Egypt today, or in Pakistan, or in Iran, a country I know well, or indeed in the Western world. The issue is of freedom of conscience, of course, of expression, of belief, of the right to change your belief, of the right to observe, practice, manifest, either alone or with other people, what you believe. Article 18 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. As I say, most countries have subscribed to this declaration. But to leave you with one thought, in the Islamic world there have been rival declarations put forward of human rights, the Cairo Declaration, for example. But in these declarations, which closely follow the UN Declaration, Article 18 is notable for its absence. Thank you very much indeed.